It is finally time to actually do a tier list video. I've been putting it off for quite some time. What's up, everybody? Here for another channel video for Tournament Sideways. I'm Casanova. I'm gonna jump right on into it. We're gonna just start with the easy ones. I know it is a meme, but it is also kind of true. I do think that the worst deck in the game is Garen. I think there's no reason to play Garen over something like Sett. They're in the same colors, but Sett's ability is quite a bit stronger. We've gotten to the point where the only time that we see Garen is because people are trying to play for the best of prizing, and they're basically just playing Aurora decks that could be Sett instead, but they are just playing Garen because it doesn't matter about the legend ability for that specific deck list and trying to make it work. So I will have Garen tier. I think there's not been a real Garen deck that is necessitates playing Garen that has really been better than anything that will even exist in D tier. I think it is the worst deck in the game, unfortunately. So I'm not going to spend much more time there on Garen. Go ahead and move on to the other kind of outlier deck and start things off with Kai'Sa. I'm going to put Kai'Sa in Z tier. I know this is like, you know, people's tier lists are always funky. You got tier 0, you got Z tier, you got... Kai'Sa stands in a league of her own, and so therefore needs her own space on the tier list. I do think that if everyone is playing 100% optimally and there's no card acquisition issues and nobody plays free will, they will just play. We should have 100% Kai'Sa in the room. I think Kai'Sa does not actually have any matchups below 50% at this point. I think there's been a lot of counter decks that have come up to try and beat Kai'Sa, and I think they've fallen flat. I do not think that there's any deck that is consistently beating her more than 50% of the time. And this is assuming perfect play. I think there's probably some players who are better than the average Kai'Sa in the room, and they're going to have some success on a couple of different decks that can quote unquote counter Kai'Sa, but I really do not think that there is a deck that can completely counter Kai'Sa and nullify her and be picked up in that way to try and farm Kai'Sas at a tournament. I think there's a lot of players who are going to find success with that strategy, being very, much better at their specific deck than the Kai'Sa player is at Riftbound, and better than them in the specific matchup. And people will find equity in that way. This is true of every card game, but I don't think there is much reason to not pick Kai'Sa. I think she is just the best deck in the game, hands down. So I will put her at Z tier. Tournaments as well, right? So she's won 3 out of 4 of the initial Chinese regional opens, and then she won the Shanghai National Open against a deck that many were saying was supposed to be very good into Kai'Sa, and it was completely dismantled multiple times by Omega Zero, just showing that that top level Kai'Sa play is a little bit too much. Going from there, I'm going to work my way kind of through this list. I think Master Yi is an easy one to just go to next. I've been a Yi hater for a very long time. I'm still kind of a Yi hater, but I will recognize that this is the second most popular deck. It has proven results. It's the only other deck to win a Chinese regional open, and it is consistently been able to make it the finals and challenge Kai'Sa in the top 8. And because of this, I think that Master Yi has to be an S tier. And as I'm going through these, I'm going to basically select what I think is the best build of the deck, and that's what I'm going to do for each of these legends. So for Master Yi, what I'm specifically talking about here is going to be essentially the Eggplant Yi, very similar to what we saw take second place at the Shanghai National Open, where it is playing around having early game units and then trying to basically skip towards that end game of playing around your Dead Bloom Predators and your White Flame Protectors. I did like the inclusion back of Qiyana. For a while, this deck was taking Qiyana out, but I think that having Qiyana in does help your Kai'Sa matchup get a lot closer and gives you some more opportunity to actually pick up wins in that matchup. I do think the Eggplant Yi is in that S tier, and I think that it is a completely reasonable deck for people to be bringing to tournament. I'm going to just go ahead and grab Lux. I'm going to place her in the D tier. I think that Lux struggles with this bit of a catch-22 in deck building right now, where you want to be putting a lot of these 5+ cost spells into your deck in order to get value out of the Lux ability, where you get to draw additional cards. The problem is when you're drawing those cards, what you then want to be able to do with drawing extra cards is being able to dump your hand with, a lot of cheap things so that you can utilize your resources to play more cards out. but you end up with this spot where you either draw only the big stuff part of your deck where you've used all of your resources, and yes, you're drawing cards, but you're just doing one big thing a turn and tapping out for it. Or you kind of get to this point where you draw all of the low-end stuff that you're trying to combine with the big spells, and it's not really producing enough for the deck. I've seen some very unique builds of Lux that have had some pretty reasonable matchups into decks like Master Yi or Aurora lists, because you have access to things like Salvage in yellow and a lot of spells that actually directly kill units instead of just dealing damage. So they do quite well into the very large go tall decks like Master Yi and Aurora decks. But the problem is, at the end of the day, is this deck has an okay matchup into those lists, but still doesn't win consistently enough, and then has a pretty much abysmal, almost unplayable Kai'Sa matchup that I just think does not allow Lux to be a solid choice. One thing that I will kind of preface, I actually think that all of the legends that we currently have a deck that feels like you're doing something powerful, and will have a lot of matchups that they can be pretty good in and they'll feel like a good deck in. But with the meta that we have of Kai'Sa and Yi, often all the decks that fall on a lower tier have a problem with one or both of those two main meta staples, even if they can feel like a powerful deck in the context of playing against everything else. And I think that Lux is one of those decks that can have that problem, has it even more so, where it feels pretty okay and does some cool things into a couple of the big stuff decks, but I think it falls very flat into Kai'Sa, and then also falls over to anything that tries to be a little bit faster, like a Darius, a Sett. Going up next, this one, I have to caveat this again. I'm putting Lee Sin in D, but the reason Lee Sin is in D is not because he is a D tier hero. I think there's like an argument to just put Lee Sin in B, and maybe I should just leave him in B instead of in D. It just depends how it makes the overall tier list look. But there's no reason in the current set in Origins to play Lee Sin over Master Yi. And the big issue is there's not enough of the spend a buff payoffs that Lee Sin has access to that do enough to make it feel more worthwhile than just playing Master Yi. And the trade-off that you generally get is maybe the signature spell or the champion zone units that you can play, but Lee Sin, having the orange Lee Sin be essentially the same unit as Master Yi's champ zone unit, doesn't really help that much as far as like its initial impact on the board, just being an accelerate that you pay 7 and a power for 6 might. Doesn't quite get it done. And then on the other side of things, like if you want to go for Lee Sin aesthetic and play the stat game plan, you end up being a hold deck, and then you could have just been Master Yi and worked a lot less hard to kind of have a similar result, if not even a better result. So because of that, Lee Sin for me, I just want to put in D tier because I think there's just no reason to pick Lee over Yi. Maybe we'll do a middle ground and we'll stick Lee Sin in C tier. But if you really want to play Lee Sin, he kind of fluctuates between B or C. Where do we want to go? But I guess the criteria for mine is there a reason to ever play this deck? And I don't think there's a reason to play Lee Sin over Master Yi, and therefore I'll just stick with him being in D tier, and I hope this is enough caveat. People who see the screenshot can get mad enough at it, but that's just my opinion on it. It's maybe power level, he's a B tier deck, but I'm going to put him in D because there's not a reason to pick him. And next up, let's do Jinx. I think Jinx is a deck that I would say some people might have the same argument of, like, let's say Jinx and Annie, where you wouldn't feel like there is much of a reason to play Jinx over Annie. They're in the same colors. They have access to a lot of the same stuff. However, I do think that Jinx can do very distinctly different things to Annie, where you could play something like the Phoenix plus Rocket recursion game plan as a deck for Jinx that is completely unavailable to Annie being able to play the same exact style. You can play more of these purple Jinx discard synergy stuff because you have purple Jinx in the champion zone that I don't think really works without the champion zone utilizing it, that I don't think Annie can necessarily play. And Jinx also, the draw card does allow you to actually play more all-in aggressive than Annie can, because you're dumping your hand and you're actually getting more cards back that you can then continue to dump out. So you get more resources in that sense, whereas Annie gets more value turn by turn and doesn't have to try and dump her hand for the extra card draw. So I actually think these two decks do play differently enough where they are not really one and the same, even being the same color combination. With all this being said, I do find that Jinx has struggled quite a bit to find her footing in best of 3 settings, even though she did find some success in city challenges. And I think it's been a rather underwhelming deck at trying to break through either Yi or Kai'Sa. They both tend to get a lot of value against her. And although she can be fast enough to kind of rush down some Aurora decks, she can have some cool builds where she can beat Yi and she can beat Kai'Sa. I think she has enough trouble with 2 of the main decks in the format that I have to put Jinx in C tier currently, even though I think there are a lot of unique ways you can continue to experiment with Jinx. And she does a relatively powerful thing, so I don't think she's the worst, but I can't really fathom putting her much higher than C. And since we were kind of talking about Annie, we'll go ahead and place her as well. I actually think Annie has been able to subvert some expectations on how good we thought she would have been, and her ability to rush down so quickly with these 2 extra runes, enabling a lot of the purple mobility, flash, ride the wind, fight or flight, all at 2 cost, being able to let Annie be a very aggressive, quick scoring aggro deck that has an insane finisher with Vi Ride the Wind that, while yes, Jinx can have access to it and access to all of these cards, the 2 runes that Annie is getting at the end of turn, allowing her to play for tempo and points in that way, has made this deck incredibly impressive to me. I think it's a little bit slept on even. I think most people do know that Annie is good, but I do think that maybe in the most recent Chinese tournaments, I thought her popularity would be higher. And I do expect Annie to make a splash in the West early on. I'm mostly going to be focusing on Sold Out's version of Annie, which is that very aggressive version. We're not talking about Hostage Annie. We want more of this Annie that's playing around the flashes, around the Ride the Winds, going in and conquering early, backing things up, and then looking for that big combo finish. And I think that is an A tier deck with game into both of the top lists. Even if Kai'Sa can be hard, you still have game there. Game into Yi because you're so quick, and then your finishers are pretty much always going to get there. And then game into a lot of the other random decks that you're going to see. Fast enough to beat Aurora down too quickly. And then also fast enough to contend with a lot of the other mid-tier decks that you will run into, like your Setts and your Dariuses. It has a reasonable matchup into all of these. So I think Annie is a very reasonable choice for your upcoming tournament series. Next up, we've got a Volibear, which this one was a bit hard for me. I think Volibear has continued to feel like it could be a Kai'Sa counter, and then when we watch it, it just doesn't get the job done. And I think we want it to be something that it just can't quite be, which is a deck that plays Aurora, that when it doesn't hit its Aurora, it's still kind of good enough. But it just, by and large, has been a little bit too slow. There's a little bit too much value coming out of a lot of these main decks that we're seeing. Yi is getting too entrenched against the Volibear, even though that matchup is like, hey, you're playing big stuff, you can kind of fight your way through, but Yi ends up with these big advantages, and then fighting through Yi's Dead Blooms gets hairy later on. And then Kai'Sa, where yes, your stuff is big and it doesn't die to the spells so easily. When you finally get on point to hold after losing a lot of the early game, Kai'Sa still has Watcher, which is just such a bane even to these big decks at just being able to push through at the end of the day. And I think because of that, Volibear has to sit in a C tier for me. I don't think the deck is terrible. I think it has just a few too many weaknesses, and maybe it's above Jinx, maybe it's a little bit better there, but I don't think much so. Hopefully our bear can find his footing. Maybe someone can find a list that works even better, but I've not been fully impressed with the bear. We've seen some decent performances on the same vein of decks that are not quite doing enough. Leona, and this one saddens me to do because I love Leona, but I am going to put her in C tier. I think Leona, if it wasn't for Kai'Sa, has a pretty reasonable matchup spread into a lot of the other decks in the game, and specifically has a very good Yi matchup. And you would think, oh, well, it only has one really bad matchup, then it must be good. But I wouldn't say it's like only one bad matchup. I just think everything else is a lot flatter, and you kind of have game into anything else, and you can win games into anything else, and the deck is pretty solid. But I have found in my large amount of testing of Leona that getting Kai'Sa to a spot that is even winnable sacrifices way too many points into the rest of your matchups. And I just think Leona is not juice worth the squeeze at this point, but I think her matchups into everything else make her better than things like Lux, and maybe even better than Jinx, especially because her Yi matchup is so positive. But she's certainly not good enough to move past this C tier area. I personally think that the best version of Leona is to be playing around yellow Leona in your champion zone. Maybe you have a green Leona in the sideboard to put in, but you're playing around conquering with your yellow Leona and then sticking a Sona and then trying to hold. And I think it's generally been the best way to play her, and if all ears, but let me know in the comments if you disagree. Sett and Darius are two decks that play quite differently, but they're both relatively aggressive decks with reasonable Kai'Sa matchups, and they're fast enough to beat up on Yi. They have a lot of tools to beat up on Yi. And in the West, they've become very popular because I think that they feel like they are incredibly strong, and they have some amount of game into both Yi and Kai'Sa. They've fallen flat over in China, and especially Darius being considered not worth playing at all because of its Kai'Sa matchup, even though we've seen some success in the West with it. And that was why originally I was going to put Darius in A tier, because I think, he actually does have a fine Kai'Sa matchup. He's good into Yi. He's overall just like one of the most powerful decks in the game as far as just creating a flat amount of might. I think not many decks can beat Hook Darius, if any. And so I was going to put him in A. I slightly changed my mind, though, because Kai'Sas are starting to main board a Cathian Rain again. And I think with that in the main board, Darius has to take one step down to the top of B tier. Because I think while the deck is still good, and it may be worth bringing to a tournament because your matchup spread into everything not named Kai'Sa is actually good, like positive matchups. I don't think that there's really many matchups that you would not want to see. If you see anything that's not Kai'Sa all day, I think you're pretty happy playing Darius. Your deck is just very strong. You're going to have a lot of win equity into just about anything. But with the Cathian Rain making it towards main boards, I would be a little bit worried bringing this deck to any upcoming tournaments until maybe the Kai'Sa deck shifts more and we see that change. On the contrast of that, Sett, another deck that has been relatively ignored in China but been very popular in the West, recently had some decent performances at the Shanghai Regional Open. And one of the big things that we saw come out of that was this new tech of playing the Divine Judgments in your Sett deck. And the big thing that this added was a win con into Kai'Sa that wasn't there previously. You had a playable matchup into Kai'Sa. You wouldn't lose every single time, but it wasn't favored. It was hard to play. And then you had decent matchups into Yi and the rest of the field. Very similar to Darius. You have these pretty good spreads into the rest of the decks. You're just kind of struggling with Kai'Sa, but you had a playable matchup, which is why he was liked in the West. But this addition of Divine Judgment, which essentially, if you can play the card in the match, you're very likely to just win, because when you put the Kai'Sa on equal footing with you on runes, units, everything, you are just a more powerful deck. Like, dragging everyone to hell with you as Sett is so strong, and it was so unexpected to be this good, but also being able to play some efficient hidden cards. Like, this Sett deck is incredibly impressive in what it does. I have been just more and more impressed with it the more I watch it, and this one may bite me because this is a newer addition to a deck, whereas the rest of it has a lot of history that I'm kind of basing these ratings off of. But this is kind of some uncharted territory where I want to put Sett maybe at the top of A, or yeah, I think it's very close with Annie. So I'm going to put Sett up here because I think this Sett deck now actually has a lot more legs as a real pick, with its ability to deal with Master Yi using Sett Brawler and just its ability to create really large amounts of might. Its ability to now deal with Kai'Sa by playing Divine Judgment and kind of closing out the game immediately there. And honestly, it's not even just Kai'Sa where the Divine Judgment can start to close out games for Sett. There's a lot more that it can do. And because of that, I really just believe in Sett now, and I'm going to put it A tier because of that. And this one, because it's some new info, may come to bite me. Next up is a favorite of many, which is one of the first Aurora decks. We're going to be doing Aurora Misfortune for this because I think it is the best build. I know there's some aggro builds running around. I don't think they're good enough. So we're going to go with Aurora MF. I think people got really high on this deck very quickly because they thought, oh, well, I can beat Kai'Sa. I'm like favored into Kai'Sa. I'm favored into Yi. And what we've seen from Shanghai, what we've seen from China is the MF decks kind of got to this very refined state pretty quickly because it's a relatively easy deck to ideate and build. And the Yi and Kai'Sa decks have continued to evolve, and they've evolved to the point where I Miss Fortune is favored into either of them anymore. I think she has very winnable matchups into both of them, and being an Aurora deck that can get it out so quickly and has the backups of not only like Ride the Wind for just purple, giving a lot of these extra movement synergies, ganking on the big units from Miss Fortune Bounty Hunter is very strong, and the ability to use bullet time as an emergency kind of fail-safe once you've gotten your Aurora developed. I think there are a lot of strong things that Miss Fortune does. So none of her matchups are going to be too horrible, except for maybe like Annie, maybe some of the more aggressive decks, just running her over, Darius. But because of this, I just can't really put MF higher than B. The results in the Chinese tournaments have just not been impressive enough. I think the deck is okay. I don't think you're doing anything bad by bringing this deck, but I just don't think it quite gets there. I will be putting it in B. I do think Aurora lists in general, if it's just an Aurora pile, I think B is about where it sits. I think Master Yi Aurora probably is like high A tier. I think it's worse than the Eggplant Aurora, or Eggplant Yi, but I think it's better than the other Aurora decks. And so we'll just put MF up here. Up next, I've got Yasuo. Yasuo is a deck that has been kind of impressing me more and more lately. We actually saw our first Yasuo crack into a day 2 of a Chinese tournament in Shanghai. It made top 128. But I've also been hearing a lot of tales of players having some success, not only in kind of evading Kai'Sa with a lot of the counter spells and teching and even more counter spells, but also being able to easily manage Yi. And so because of this, I do think Yasuo is going to be probably at the very bottom of B tier. I think it doesn't quite fall to C. It's either top of C or bottom of B. It is a little bit worse than the other decks that I have at B right now, but it is a little bit better than what I've got at C. So it's going to fall somewhere in that limbo area. I've seen a lot of different lists having varying degrees of success. So unfortunately, I don't have a specific list in mind, but let's go ahead and say, you know, that the highest placing Yasuo from Shanghai, I think is like a low B deck. And maybe if you can figure out an even better list from there, Yasuo can move his way up the B tier on the tier list and maybe even find some more success from there. But I do like Yasuo. I think it is a good deck, but probably not good enough that if you're very serious about winning a tournament, you should bring it. I think you have to be somewhere up here if you're very serious, probably stops at A tier. And even then, maybe you should just play Kai'Sa if you're really serious. So we've got kind of our last few here. Ahri has been seeing some recent success. It did have a top 128 at Shanghai. And we've heard a lot of rumblings about players having a lot more success with Ahri, and it feeling like that was a bit of a disappointing performance from both the Chinese and the Western scene, with some players citing that they've been able to tune their decks to be favored into Kai'Sa, which again, personally, if you heard me earlier in the video, I don't believe that you can build your deck to necessarily be favored into Kai'Sa. I think you will still be somewhere around 50. But if you can be 50 and still be good into everything else, or good into a lot of other things, then I'm all for it. And I think the Time Warp builds of Ahri with Green Ahri Champ Zone, playing for tempo and then winning with Warp, are actually very good lists that are pretty reasonable tournament choices, especially when you start heavily teching blue and green, having good anti-Kai'Sa tech with the counter spells, with retreats. You have ways to kind of deal with Kai'Sa, find more win equity into Kai'Sa. I think this deck is an A, specifically looking at like the QQ variation of Time Warp, Green Ahri. We've seen a couple other players play this. Presto has played a version. We saw some in China. We even originally saw it in China, but that kind of Ahri is what I'm talking about. I think it is an A tier deck. I think it's very reasonable to bring that Ahri to a tournament and expect to do well. And I think that if you're playing those like mainboard retreats and really leaning into mainboarding a lot of this Kai'Sa hate, I think the deck can get to enough win equity that it feels worthwhile to bring, especially if you are extremely practiced on Ahri. Some of your opponents are not going to be nearly as good at the matchup as you are. And if you know everything inside and out of your deck, you can get some meaningful edge. Speaking of decks that underperformed, maybe people are going to get mad at me for this one. I am going to put Viktor, our perennial 4% conversion rate, but third most represented deck in the field deck. I'm going to stick him squarely in B tier. Now, he is better than Yasuo, that's for sure, but I think he's a B tier deck. I don't think Viktor is good enough right now. I think there's a lot of variations to how you can build Viktor, and because of that, it is really hard to pinpoint what is the exact best Viktor build. If someone can figure out something that works really well for a tournament with your Kai'Sa matchup, then you can prove me wrong on this one. But I'm going to go with the data for the Viktor point in particular, in the fact that as much as he has been a popular pick in China, his conversion rate has been so abysmal consistently over the course of the entire set in China that I cannot justify putting him higher than a B. And that leaves us with one final one, and I think this is a bit of a spicy take overall, and one that people may disagree with me on. But recently, I've been very impressed with Teemo. And I think that the build has gotten to a point where it has a very favorable Yi matchup and a very playable Kai'Sa matchup while still maintaining good field equity, like good into the random stuff that you're going to run into, and particularly good into Aurora decks. And because of this, I actually want to put Teemo in S tier right below Yi. I think that as people continue to refine Teemo, I think there's a little room for tweaks. I've been working on Teemo a bit, and I've seen other players talking about Teemo, and I think that there are some really good ideas that are continuing to be explored to help it in the Kai'Sa matchup that don't seem to sacrifice any points anywhere else. And because of that, I think Teemo is like my sleeper pick for these upcoming tournament season. I think he is still a worse choice than Kai'Sa or Yi, but I think he is a better choice than most of the rest of the field if he is a deck that interests you. And I think if you get really good on Teemo, there are a lot of sneaky things that this deck gets to do that if your opponent is not intimately aware or familiar with the Teemo matchup, you will gain a lot of equity playing it. And because of all of those factors, I do put him slightly above here in the S tier, just below Yi and just below Kai'Sa. So with that, that is every single legend put onto a tier list. I will finish with saying that I actually do believe that every legend is strong in some right. Garen, maybe the exception, but every legend, you can play a deck with that legend that feels like you're doing a very powerful thing in Riftbound. And what holds back legends currently is just a metagame that has a very hostile queen of Kai'Sa that is so much of the field that if you can't have a good Kai'Sa matchup while maintaining your identity and being good in your other kind of matchups that you're supposed to be better in, you just can't really play the deck. And so we'll leave it with that. And Lee Sin is both simultaneously in D tier and also B tier, because I just think there's no reason to play him over Yi. So I'll just move him up last second to the B tier for that, but anyone who missed that. But I hope that you enjoyed this video. I hope that you enjoyed this tier list. Please let me know what points you agreed with, what you don't agree with in the comments down below. I really love the conversation as we continue to move towards this 10K at SCG Con, the 10K in Georgia, and even the Houston regional qualifiers coming up. So thanks for watching. Please remember to hit the subscribe button for more content like this, and click one of these other videos that we've got around here, and I'll see you on the next one.